So what if I could tell you that all the experience that we collectively have gone through the whole world about COVID and the pandemic and the shutdowns and the sheltering in place and all the deaths and all the mortality, that there's actually some learnable lessons there that I don't mean about masking or about what you can do for yourself. There's actionable information that's simple enough and profound that came out because we had such a collectively horrific situation for 2 to 3 or maybe more years, depending where you live. But it happened worldwide, in which all these cultures now take all that information, not just who died and who got hurt, but all the blood work. And so now we get an understanding of the patient side of the perspective. What was it that set them all apart? What did they have in common? And if they had things in common, could we address those things and perhaps be ahead of the curve and perhaps really defend ourselves? And sure enough, it comes through black and white, but it would not have happened had there not been this massive pandemic, if that's what you want to call it, of all these labs, of all these countries coming together saying, this is what we're seeing and we're trying this, we're trying that. It's an amazing coming together of something very comprehensive that would have never happened had it not been for COVID. And I want to go into that to show you what we learned, but to set the stage, build the context so you really know how valuable these discoveries are, because they are something that you can use. It's not something you have to go running to your doctor about, but it's something you can use in your home to save your life this flu season, save your life every flu season, and everybody else around you. It is profound. So let's get to it, okay? All right, so my pitch is your glutathione level will determine how well you survive this flu season, and next flu season, and the flu season after that, and the flu season in perpetuity. I kid you not, and I'm not exaggerating. So is it going to be just a passing experience for you? Some people actually had a passing experience for COVID. Others died. Why do you think that was? In part, it was their comorbidities, but that's a kind of a general term. Let's go a little deeper on that, which is what we will be doing today. Or is it a prolonged acute? You just can't quite throw it off and you feel miserable for a very long time. Or does it get even worse? You get long COVID, long haul COVID, and worse than that, you die. People have died. Many people have died. But we know who have died and we know why they've died, and that's what this is about. That has never really been discussed. So the most important thing we learned from COVID-19, and it's 19 because it was 2019 when it started, supposedly, that we never knew and could save lives every flu season. Okay, so long COVID contributed to thousands of deaths. This is the CDC, so this is pretty good information if you want to reference that. Death certificate records mentioned long COVID, not just COVID, long COVID, as early as April 2020. So first, I need to do some basic epidemiology, basic science, basic understanding before we get into the details. So how do we get sick? We're talking about viral respiratory infections, whether it's COVID, whether it's the flu, whether it's RSV, whether it's strep A. Strep A is actually bacterial, but we're talking about viral infections, okay? Okay, first you need exposure. Then you need the infection. Then you need a buildup of the viral load. So yeah, some part, if you were introduced to a large viral load, that matters, but usually that doesn't differentiate that much. We're all exposed to pretty much the same amount, and we get it or we don't get it, and that depends on us, on our immune system. So viral exposure, viral infection, viral replication, the viral load is now building up and building up and building up. The question is, at this point, can you control it? Step 2 is increasing pulmonary lung oxidative damage during that viral replication. And if it continues, you have advanced respiratory distress, otherwise known as ARDS. Increased viral load further leads to death. Pretty straightforward. So step 1, 2, and 3. The third step is uncontrolled hyperinflammation. And that's what we hear so much about. Certainly the people who have died, they're put on ventilation, which is called ECMO. But it is never about being exposed to the virus. It is never about being exposed to the virus. We all get exposed eventually. Unless you're hiding under a bed and somebody's delivering your food, but we all get exposed. It's always about, can your immune system create an adequate response and control the viral replication or not? So this is about the one thing you need to know for this flu season. And actually will be, spoiler alert, 3 things, but they're all interrelated. So what we know of flu season, it peaks in February. And this is the flu season over the last 40 years. And so you really need to, this is going to happen. This is the Northern Hemisphere, of course. It's going to happen year after year after year after year after year. So it's not like, oh, we just missed COVID. Well, there's going to be something else, maybe not as bad, but there's always viruses in the air. They're worse in the winter. And yeah, in part it's by vitamin D, but that's not the whole story by any shot. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this video. Okay, so how do we know that actually flu season is worse in February? Well, the degree that we can trust the CDC, it's 40 years of them data taking and saying of all the cases, both of morbidity, people who really suffer all the symptoms but don't die, and the mortality, those who do die, okay? They over 40 years. So I'm pretty certain with that it looked that way. If you go back 100 years more, it was pretty much the same thing. Different viruses, perhaps, but always the same mix. So for coronavirus, it's always around. It's maybe not that particular version, but anyway. Okay, so what we know about our current flu season this winter, that's happening so far. So right now, this is January 5th, 2023. So in the US, is it a concern yet? So I'm getting this from a couple of newspapers, New York Times, and I'll reference it down below as you'll see. So what this year's flu season looks like, percent of weekly doctor and hospital visits for respiratory illness. So this is visits, just the visit level. They showed up, for the visit. I don't feel great. They didn't go to the hospital, but it's doctor and hospital visits. So it's the whole 9 yards. So what do we see? This year, flu season, so influenza, we're saying it's off to a horrendous spike, if you will. Let's compare it to previous years. So we have 3 years ago, we had these 3 spikes, 1, 2, 3, and it lasted all the way till April. The last spike was in April. So it's 2019 when COVID-19 started to 20. 2 years ago is down here. 2 years ago wasn't a big deal. It was kind of a sleeper. Last year was also kind of a sleeper, but it had a big spike up around January. So about now. And then it settled down, came back in April and July, but pretty much settled down. The average of all 3 years is this dotted line, up, down. So according to that comparison, this year is off to a hellacious start for the flu. The flu is a viral infection. It's influenza, just like we used flu for the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So includes people infected with influenza, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, the coronavirus, COVID, and other respiratory viruses. Weekly hospitalizations. Now it's a whole level. It's not a visit, it's hospitalizations. They need to be hospitalized. If they came into the ER, they go, no, I'm sorry, you're staying overnight for observation in the very least. And most likely they descended into maybe even being on ventilators. So they were quickly getting bad. Weekly hospitalizations for COVID, RSV, and flu compared to past years. RSV is always about children for the most part. Well over 99% is for children under 4. But here we go. So again, now we're talking about COVID, RSV, and flu. 3 separate areas here, 3 separate graphs that I lined up. All right, we have, well, COVID's not a big deal. It's kind of a sleeper this year. The prior 3 seasons were a lot higher. Okay, RSV for children primarily. That was up to a horrendous start. I know my grandnephew had to go by ambulance from his daycare center to the hospital because of RSV. But the prior 4 seasons was kind of a sleeper. So that spike looks like it's coming back down. The flu is just taking off like a bat out of hell. And this is in the United States. Weekly hospitalizations among children under 4. So again, it's all about respiratory syncytial virus. Up, down, it's still going on, still plenty high. It's just coming down from its peak. We'll see. COVID-19 is kind of a sleeper, and the flu is creeping up. Weekly hospitalizations among adults 65 or over. We're going to get into data later, but we're getting into those that had the highest percentage in total out of the population of deaths, mortality due to COVID. COVID is coming down. Flu is still going up, and some over 65 are having RSV. Flu season ramped up early this year. Now this is just the flu season, the flu. 22 to 23 this season, as of probably 2 weeks ago, it's way ahead of schedule. Here's the previous 12 seasons. So you can see it's like, wow, what happened? How did that get started so early? I would say that's probably 2 months early. U.S. influenza hospitalizations see early climb. Again, flu up, looks like according to this, CNN Health, it was coming down. It spiked in December, and we'll see what's happening. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to say there's a context here. We have a flu season every year, and for some reason when COVID happened, nobody talked about the flu season. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that. So COVID-19 patients in U.S. hospitals. This is, did a hospital head count? How many people were we're there because of COVID-19. We are starting, there's April 21, it's a year and a half, ends at December 22nd, just not even 2 weeks ago. Okay, up, down, peaked in January is what we're trying to say. From started, that was in pretty much August, and down, then up in January. There's such a thing called a flu season. RSV. RSV has surpassed recent seasons in just 2 months. Cumulative hospitalizations per 100,000 people by season. Here's this season again. RSV is taking off like a bat out of hell. Here's the 4 previous seasons for RSV hospitalizations. Pretty extreme. So we'll see what happens. According to the other graphs, it's starting to come down. Okay, RSV hit young children hard this season. Here we go, 19, 20, 21, 22, year after year. So RSV is always around. And this year is just huge. Do we know why? So what's the difference between these three? RSV, COVID-19, and the flu? They're all viral. Check. That's why they have that. They're obviously a little bit different, but in terms of symptomology, for these kids, the kids don't have diarrhea or fatigue. It's hard to tell a 4-year-old how tired you are. They don't have headaches or body aches. They basically have sneezing, sore throat, wheezing, pretty straightforward things. COVID-19 is, the only thing it doesn't have is a decrease in appetite or sneezing. So there's no sneezing in COVID-19, but you lose your sense of taste, you lose your sense of smell, body aches, fever, chills, the whole 9 yards. And the flu is pretty much the same, except that, again, no decrease in appetite. The flu doesn't have a loss of smell and doesn't have shortness of breath, no sneezing or wheezing. What's in the news over the last 14 days? So we tend to pretend that it's not a big deal. You know, one way we hear fear, 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 here's all the data, hide under your bed for the next 10 years and you'll be hiding under your bed for the rest of your life. So it's a bit extreme. So we tend to stop hearing it. And then we say, well, this is just another year. There's nothing to worry about. My point is, it is something to worry about. It happens each year, but there are some very good things you can do to make that worry less as we get into it. But this is from the Boston Globe, December 23rd. Look at that. Wellesley woman dies from flu complications, a 1 in a million case. Why is it a 1 in a million case? Here we go. Now, even while working as an executive at American Express and Burberry, raising a family in Wellesley with her husband, 36-year-old remained a passionate Boston sports fan and successful athlete, playing tennis, skiing, and even competing in the New York Marathon in under 4 hours. But early this week, so she has no comorbidities. She's not overweight, she's not diabetic, of course it doesn't say it in the article. But early this week, McMahon's health suddenly declined, and by Tuesday afternoon she died. Within a week, her death certificate lists the shocking reasons, complications from the flu. What the heck? Each year, millions of Americans get sick from the flu. Roughly 12 to 50 million die from complications each year from the flu. That's the normal. But it's unusual for an otherwise healthy younger adult to die from the virus. We don't know all her labs, but I'm just saying it's not about comorbidities in this particular situation. Spikes in COVID and influenza. So Boston Public Schools, I'll paraphrase this, are thinking maybe they should reinstitute masking, even though masking doesn't do anything. And so there's a prompt push for post-holiday masking in Boston Public Schools, masking mandate for the first 2 weeks of school after the break. It's of no improvement, but it makes people feel happier. Okay then. So there you go. It's about city health leaders who are discussing a temporary masking mandate for the first 2 weeks of school, etc., etc. Again, just about not even 2 weeks ago. In China, the story is a little bit different. It's a reality. They think the numbers are way underreported. It seems to be way out of hand. But here's just some pictures from this. There's no room for COVID complacency in 2023. Nature. COVID is spreading rapidly in China. New signs suggest, and that's Christmas. Here's from PBS NewsHour. So PBS, on TV. New COVID subvariant spreads rapidly in Northeast, sparking concerns it evades vaccines. So there's the broadcast. So what comes out of it, subvariant XBB.1.5. More than 40% of U.S. COVID infections, around 75% of cases in the Northeast, just over 1/3 of Americans who are over 65, etc., etc. Here's from The Guardian, the UK, across the pond. Could new Omicron variant, XBB.1.5, fuel further COVID infections? Who knows? There's always going to be another variant out there. The offshoot accounts for 40% of COVID cases in the US, which we just heard about. And that was 2 days ago. Okay, here's flu and RSV on the decline, but COVID hospitalizations are rising, possibly because of the variant. And this was just 4 days ago. holiday gatherings, travel, however, could send flu activity up again. Yep, maybe that's the case. What I'm saying, though, is it's another year of the same variations, the same stew of viruses that are going to be around you. So let's figure out what to do. And this is what we got from COVID. We've learned some significant things, and primarily not from the institutions of the Western, not from deep research by pharmaceutical companies in the United States. Okay, so COVID by the numbers. This is the 1918 pandemic, otherwise known as the Spanish flu, right? So what the past is showing us, now we're going to get to population, who was affected, who died. Let's look at the breakdown by age group. Weekly numbers of COVID-19 associated hospitalization. These are bad cases, right? They had hospitalized in the United States. This is current. So March of 2020 to basically March of 2022. What I want you to see here is just age groups. So we have roughly 3 age groups, right? We're going to have gray as 18 to 40, I call that 20 to 50, 30 years, 50 to 64, 15 years, 65 and over. So that's the gray, the red, and the green. So what we can see without getting so into the numbers, the green group seems to be the largest. Gosh, that's 65 years and over. And under that is 50 to 64. Something else I want you to get out of this is that the flu season is solidly from November to March. The flu season is solidly from November to March. It's here in 2021. It looks like there was in August, it started, it went down and then really spiked. And this is where we are right now. So that there is a defined flu season for the most part. All right, so total deaths from COVID-19. Now we're looking back over 3 years in the United States and find out who actually died. Now it's pretty definitive. You died, that's a statistic we can't argue about. Okay, so the age groups are up to 18, 18 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 64, 64 to 65 to 75, 75 to 85. What I want you to see is up to age 50, that is up to the 40 to 49 and all the previous age groups, only not even 6+ % of all the deaths were from 50 and under. So of the actual deaths, so if you have all the number, we're not even talking about percent per age group, all the deaths under age 50, only 6+ % happened. Over age 50, you had 93+% happened over the age of 50. So what happens between 49 and 50? And let's break it down a little more. Between 50 and 64, what I want you to see is roughly, they're not exactly even, but they're getting pretty even. It gradually is going up, but certainly 65 to 75 is almost the same as 75 to 85, which is almost the same as 85 and older. They're just slightly different, but all of this is 50 and older. So now we are going to break it down by percent. So what I want to show you now, if you have the whole population of the United States and slice that by age groups, just people, forget about deaths or not, or infections, just people, you're going to find that 4 and under, there's only 6% of the population, or 5 to 11, so on and so forth. So now you see the percentage of the population is pretty low. So now we get to age group of 18 to 30, okay? That represents 15% of the population. So 50% of the entire population, in terms of death from COVID, it's only 6%. Or actually, sorry, 0.7%, not even a percent. So it's very low. So very few people of that age group died. I know we're hearing cardiomyopathy and carditis and so on and so forth. That's in this group, by the way, up to age 39. But even of the population, what we see in age 30 to 39, they only represent about 15% of the entire population, but under 2% of all deaths. And 40 to 49 is getting a little bit higher. That age group represents just over 12% of the population and just 4% of all the deaths. So yes, it's going up. This is the same graph I just showed you, but look how it just suddenly pivots from 49 to 50 in that age group. Yes, that's 10 years and this is 15 years. Suddenly it goes from 4% of the population died from 40 to 49, and suddenly it goes up to nearly 20% from 50 to 64. And it goes up 20, that's called 18%, 22% from the next age group over 65 to 75, 26%, 75 to 85, so 22, 26, 26 again. They're all pretty even by a little bit. Obviously, they were increasing. But when you look at the group, the percent of the population from 65 to 75 is not even 10%, yet they represent over 20% of the deaths. The population of the United States between 75 and 84 is only under 5% of the population, and they represent over a quarter of the deaths. So what is happening to that age group, to these age group? What happens? And I'm going to explain that. So I'm setting up the question. So the ages between 18 and 50 represent 42% of the population, but only 6% plus of total deaths. The population in the United States of over age 50 is 36%. We're rounding up. So 36% of the population in the United States is over the age 50. They represent almost 94% of deaths due to COVID in the United States. What's up? Here we're looking back on 1918, the Spanish flu, and we're looking very specifically because if you've done any reading about the Spanish flu, they go, oh, there was 3 waves, and they were all a different age group. The first wave was the middle age, and then it was young, and then it was the older. Well, when all the data is now collected, right, those who died, and so there's pretty definitive data, they found that wasn't the case at all. Very few people died under age 50. There's that same line. So now we're going back 100 years and we're saying it's the same line still. Wow, something happens over age 50. So looks like over 90% of the deaths from the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu, was over age 50. So here we have respiratory-related deaths. That's more of a generalization of all the flus that were going on. And this was all-cause mortality. So you see it's pretty much the same spike. First wave, second wave, third wave of the different waves. It wasn't until the dotted line is final wave. So the final wave was more of the older, but every wave was more of the older. The last wave was more of the older. Okay, so what did we learn from that? We learned that the age group most affected by COVID, the flu, etc., were those over 50, more men than women. I didn't point out the men could have thought that was a little too tedious, but more men than women, roughly a 2.4 to 1 ratio of men to women, by the way. That pattern hasn't really changed since the pandemic of 1918. So the significance of the lab data recorded during this global pandemic is enormous. It's coming from all the countries. We're now all online. We're all pretty sophisticated. The hospitals are not little grass huts. You know, they're now pretty equal. Maybe they're slightly in more developed countries are better, but we have a lot of information that we can put together to give us a picture of how are these people dying from this COVID. We're having the same thing, and yeah, it mutates. It's slightly different here or there, but we can say they had the same virus. They had the same set of viruses for the season, and why was there this difference? So we have a lot of data that we never would have had. It's basically like an experiment, if you will, on humans. And you don't experiment on humans. That's why we have all our research that comes from rats and mice primarily, right? And we deduce from the data we have from mice that this is how it's going to be with humans. Here, we have human data. That's the difference. We have human data, and so there's no interpretation that actually happened to humans. And now we're differentiating humans, and how are they different? And that's the key here. So there was one other time in history in which you had all this human data because of a huge catastrophe experienced by a large population of people in a very well documented culture. And that is, so just to finish that sentence, unlike any other period in human history except for one other human catastrophe, and that is the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 45. I did a video on this should you want to go into it. I'm not going to go into it much, but I'm going to say this was the birthplace of epigenetics. They found in the end of World War II, from basically the summer of 44 to through the winter of 44 to 45, Holland, the Netherlands, was blocked in by the Germans. But that, and you would have said, well, here's the picture of that. You say, well, look at all this ocean front. You know, you would have thought all the Allies could have gotten in, but no, it was a severely cold winter and it was all iced up. So there was no easy coming and going. And so for 6 months, you had a huge population that basically starved. So the data was, what does it look like for humans to starve? And so you have gender, you have age, you have those who died, obviously, those who lived through it and their sufferings, those who conceived. And when did they conceive? Early in the siege, later in the siege, those who were born during the starvation period. And so they got tracked. All this data was put down, and they found there was this big differentiation of those who died and didn't. But on this particular situation, what they found out is that the children of those who existed during that starvation period, who conceived during that starvation period at different junctures, their kids were different. So because they were starving, and it makes kind of sense, because they were starving, their kids came out that were born differently, had certain diseases and size, and their kids' were different, and their kids' were different. And this is going on and on and on. This human data that happened is kind of a very twisted experiment, but it revealed a lot of information and began what is known as epigenetics. So I'll go into that. One other discovery that happened here by a doctor named William Carroll Dick, they were all starving and they're eating very little. And Sweden flew in flour, just dropped it down, big bags of flour, and they all ran out and they got it so they could make flour. They suddenly all could make flour and had calories, right? So now they were starving less. Some people got worse, and he discovered that it was not only the wheat, but it was the gluten in the wheat that caused celiac disease. So the origin of celiac disease was defined, identified during the Dutch hunger winter in Holland because of this situation. It was profound, and he was going to get the Nobel Prize, but a Nobel Prize is for living researchers and doctors and for living people. And he died 2 weeks before the ceremony, so it went to somebody else. Discovery of gluten as the injurious component in celiac disease, 2011, not that long ago. The grim origins of gluten-free. It took an act of war for doctors to learn how to treat celiac disease, and that's in 2019. It's still being looked at. This was huge. That's why I show these pictures of the starvation for sure, the wheat, that's the dropping of the flour, and Dr. Dick. And if anybody who's a war buff, you'll know about the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was happening at the same time, just about 2.5 hours to the southwest. Legacy of the Dutch hunger winter. I'm just going to touch this briefly. 44 to 45. The Dutch famine of 44 to 45 was a rare case of a famine which took place in a modern, developed, and literate country. The well-documented experience helped scientists to measure the effects of famine on human health and its effects on subsequent generations of those who experienced it. The Dutch Famine Birth Cohort Study, that's what it's called. It's this ongoing cache of data that's being tracked. It's the F1, the first generation, the second generation, the third generation. I think they're up to the fourth generation of tracking these genetic changes that clearly were different than just what these people were born into. It was because of the famine caused something in the gene, so they call that epigenetics. This is where it all got started. The children of pregnant women exposed to famines were more susceptible to diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, microalbuminuria, which is elevated protein, and other health problems. They were smaller, as expected. When these children grew up, their children were smaller than average as well. The data suggested that the famine experienced by the mothers caused some kind of epigenetic change that were passed down to the next generation. From this era of data also generated these ideas of transgenerational trauma, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, and the thrifty gene hypothesis. So I hope you see that video. I wanted to mention that this is what the pandemic is turning into. All this data is now being revealed in an uncontrolled way, and so it's a little more truthful, if you will. So the connection to COVID-19 and the pandemic? Well, there's a tsunami of new COVID data from around the world that is allowing us to understand what we would never have been able to verify. We might have suspected it, and we all have our nutritional protocols and all our things to build up our immune system, but we would never have been able to verify what has gone on in terms of the human population at such a large scale. So just like the Dutch hunger winter did for epigenetics, which started a new way of thinking about genetics, it's a windfall of human data mined from each country's experience of COVID-19 that is giving us a new insight into how to protect and minimize the symptoms of the next flu season. Seriously, what always breaks first? The front door. This is about how you get infected. If you can't breathe, not much else matters. Pretty straightforward. Anonymous quote from an ER physician. Breathing is a balance between these two receptors, and maybe you remember some of this from the news that was covered. You have ACE receptors, and I'm not going to go deep into biochemistry, but you need to know that it's called angiotensin converting enzymes, and if you've heard that word before, some people are on them for their blood pressure, so they on this medication, which is an ACE inhibitor, to keep down their blood pressure, right? So it dilates, it blocks these receptors. So breathing, ACE2, that could have been ACE1, but ACE2 is a vasodilator. It does just the opposite. ACE1 constricts. Right here, vasoconstriction, it's a pro-oxidant, pro-inflammation, pro-fibrosis, pro-apoptosis, which is cell death. And ACE2 is just the opposite. It's opening, it's an antioxidant, it's antifibrotic, anti-inflammatory, and anti-cell death. So it's always a balance between these two. You need a little bit of, we got to constrict and we got to kill whatever is infecting, but if it gets too carried away, it kills the patient as well. So know that. This is what's breaking. Okay, along comes COVID. It's about the ratio between ACE and ACE2, ACE1 and ACE2 receptors. In its simplest terms, all respiratory viruses affect this ratio. So specifically, COVID came into ACE2, supposedly a spike protein on the virus. It really doesn't matter. They all come in, that's how they get into the cell. They come into the ACE2, so they block the ACE2 from being able to be an antioxidant. They block the ACE2 from being a vasodilator, opening things up. So it stops that. It makes it non-functional. That's the leg up the virus has. Okay, so where are these receptors? Clearly they're in the nose, the back of the throat, and all of the lungs. That's where it starts. That's the front door. The nose, the back of the throat, the lungs. If that gets inhibited, if that gets blocked, if they get in through these cells, it's all downhill from there. So primarily it is the lung. Endothelia is within your blood vessels, intestines, heart, testes, kidneys. So COVID comes in, it blocks the ACE2, ACE1s, causes a lot of reactive oxygenated species called ROS, otherwise known as free radicals. Gets worse and worse down special pathways. Who cares? It gets rather exacerbated inflammation like I showed you before, and it leads to lung failure. So these are the patients that are put on ventilators. These are the patients put on ECMO, and so it goes. So bad news. It blocks this is what I want you to know. I'm going to give you the punchline, but I'm going to be covering this in subsequent videos of each one of these points. So what we know and what has been discovered from the data collected through the pandemic so far is one, endogenous deficiency of glutathione, started off with glutathione, is most likely the cause of the serious manifestations, symptoms, and so on, and death in COVID-19 patients. We're going to talk more about that. Glutathione deficiency, second thing, limits the effectiveness of vitamin D. So it really doesn't matter how much vitamin D you have if you don't have glutathione. That was never known before. The risk of suspected was never known before. The risk of severe COVID can be stratified by omega-3 index quartile. That means that the less omega-3 you have, EPA and DHA, fish oil if you want to call it that, the less that you have, the more severe are you going to be your symptoms. So now you have three different things here. You have the glutathione, the vitamin D, and the fish oil, right? So the next three videos will be going deeper into what, why, and how to use these three discoveries to protect yourself from any flu season, but especially the flu season we're headed into that I just told you about. Till then. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.